how can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. You know, the people are the ones that can make the change.
Just out of curiosity, what first piqued your attention about Ecuador? How did it hit your radar as a journalist?
I've always been interested in writing about Ecuador, about its economic problems earlier. But for the last several years, I've really been writing and focusing specifically on this. And for a number of years, I was writing about how Ecuador was a tinderbox that was set to explode, because you saw these worrying signs. In Guayaquil, suddenly the escalation of the conflict between the gangs involved bombings of entire apartment complexes just to try to assassinate one major figure. And this was really out of sync and a huge departure and outlier from what violence had looked like in that region previously. And a lot of the indications pointed to kind of a singular event in 2020, in which the leader of the largest organized crime group, the largest domestic organized crime group in Ecuador, the Choneros, the leader was assassinated in 2020. And what was apparent from the outside even then was that this had sparked a power struggle within splinter factions of that organization. But what's become increasingly clear in the years since is that it's not just that battle between different factions of the Choneros, but also a whole host of international criminal organizations, money, arms, and connections that have fed into not a proxy conflict, but have transformed the nature of violence and conflict in Ecuador, particularly on the coast.
Is it largely based just due to the narco economy? Maybe not necessarily in Ecuador, but it's obviously sandwiched in between Peru and Colombia, which, I mean, let's be honest, one of their main exports is cocaine.
Well, yeah, of course, absolutely. So, I mean, this is not really an Ecuadorian problem. This is the latest manifestation of a regional, if not the international problem, which is the cocaine trade. So Ecuador has never been a large producer of cocaine. That's produced primarily, of course, in Colombia, as well as in Peru and in Bolivia. But Ecuador has always been a strategic transshipment point for cocaine. And in the last decades, a lot of cocaine was traveling directly from Colombia by various overseas and air routes to the United States. But in the last about 10 years, there's been a really big shift with drug consumption and with the profit motive for drug trafficking. And that is that American drug consumers have increasingly turned towards opiates and towards methamphetamine, and drug consumption in Europe has exploded. So from 2016, I think just till 2020, the seizures of cocaine in ports like Rotterdam in the Netherlands has quadrupled, indicating this massive jump in the consumption of cocaine and in the demand for cocaine in Europe. And this has meant that the nature of the cocaine trade has shifted, and the emphasis, while of course there continues to be an enormous amount of trafficking in the United States, the real money lies in shipping cocaine to Europe. And with a Colombian prop plane, you cannot fly, from Bogota to Amsterdam. So this means that the primary route in which cocaine is smuggled to Europe is through shipping containers. And in Ecuador, the port of Guayaquil is an incredibly strategic transshipment point to Europe. And there's a lot of opportunity, particularly because of the export of bananas, which is a bit specific and funny, but containerized bananas have to be loaded and have to be unloaded very quickly. So the capacity for authorities, both in Ecuador and in the European ports to which these containers travel, to check all of this is limited. And an enormous amount of cocaine is now smuggled to European consumers through containerized bananas on international shipping lines.
What kept Ecuador out of the cocaine production industry? I'm assuming I'm not an expert in the geography of the region, but does it have the same climate and growing ability as, let's say, Colombia and Peru on the the northeast and the southern borders?
The development of Ecuador's trade in drugs really has to do more with the establishment of the principal powers. So, in the 1990s, for example, the cocaine trade in that region was really very strongly controlled by the FARC in Colombia. And in Peru as well, these sort of established guerrilla armies that created deeper links with narco trafficking organizations and engaged in the drug trade allowed for this expansion of the business. But these were regimented, incredibly well organized armies and criminal operations. And Ecuador did not develop these kinds of groups. In part, I think also because economic conditions in Ecuador during the 1990s and 2000s were much better. So it was harder to draw in desperate young people who were looking to criminal enterprise to sustain themselves and their family. And so Ecuador has always been crucial and central in the drug trade, but not in the production of drugs. And in terms of the nature of violence and power, Ecuador's homeborn criminal organizations were largely partners to these larger international organizations, principally, of course, the FARC from Colombia, until 2016 when the FARC demobilized. And this created a real turning point in Ecuador and in the drug trade in general from that point onwards.
Yeah, and fast forwarding now, I think a lot of people in the Western world would probably struggle to find Ecuador on a map. They probably don't hear very often about breaking news in Ecuador. But one thing I do remember seeing myself happened actually in January, and it was a video of an armed gang taking over a TV broadcast studio. I believe they were live at the time in Ecuador. Can you talk about what actually happened there, what led up to that, and what they were trying to achieve by doing so?
What happened that day, and it was January 9, so not very long ago, is an event I think that will be remembered by certainly all of the television viewers in Ecuador who are tuning into that program, and I think will mark kind of a historic turning point in the history of the country and the way that people remember it, because it was this very sort of dramatic wake-up call. So in the immediate days preceding that, Daniel Noboa, who won an election and took office in November to serve out an interim presidency, the remainder of Guillermo Lazo's term, he's pursued sort of a more stringent and aggressive security policy. And early January 4th, I believe, he declared that he had plans to construct 2 new maximum security prisons using the same company and design of the jails created in El Salvador as part of Bukele's security crackdown, and signaled that he was, going to try to transform prison policy and security policy. And then a few days later, on January 7th, the current leader of the Choneros, a man named Jose Adolfo Macias, better known as Fito, escaped from prison. And this was, one of the key, if not the most important leader of organized crime in Ecuador. And plans had been to transfer him to another more secure prison. And instead, clearly, through corruption and with information that should not have been accessible to him, he instead was able to escape. And in response to that, on January 8th, the President Noboa declared a state of exception and mobilized the military in a hunt for him. And this set off a series of massive prison riots around the country. And that led on January 9th then to an escalation of gang attacks across the country. And this saw them invade hospitals, universities, carry out bombings and shootings. And in the most dramatic of these attacks, a group of armed men stormed this live television broadcast in Ecuador. And this was really a show of power from the gangs, illustrating that, they are now political players and can push back against the security policies of the state and flex their own muscle. And this has led to sort of this current push by the government, with the president declaring the same day of these massive attacks that the country was in a state of internal armed conflict. And he designated the nation's criminal organizations, 22 or so gangs, as terrorist groups, and has begun sort of a new phase of an attempted security crackdown in Ecuador.